Hello everyone, welcome to today's video. In this video we will be talking about the throw keyword which is used in Java exception handling. So as of now we have already talked about the try catch block and the finally block which is used in exception handling. We have also discussed about the different ways and combinations in which these blocks could be used in coordination with each other. However, there are two other ways in which we can handle exceptions in Java. So the one is the throw keyword and the other one is the throws. So in today's video we will be talking about the throw keyword in detail, which is used to handle explicit exceptions. So all of this we will be talking about in details in today's session. So talking about, before we go deeper into the topic, first let us look into a small program and how basically an exception is handled by JVM, or how an exception is addressed by JVM. So suppose we have a class by the name ABC, and here I have the main method as public static void main and string arguments. So under this main method, what we will have is, I have two numbers. I have a number which is int a, and then b equal to 0, then c is equal to a by b, and if I'm trying to print the value of c. So when we are trying to do this, 50 divided by 0, this will throw me an exception. Now in this line, the exception is occurring. So whenever an exception is encountered, the method under which the exception has occurred. So in this scenario, the exception has occurred under the main method. So this main method will be creating an object, exception object, with the details like the exception class name, then we have the description followed by the stack trace. Here, talking about stack trace, we mean to say that it will give us exactly the line number in which the exception has occurred. So in this object would be created by the method where the exception has occurred, and this object will be sent to JVM for exception handling. Now JVM, what it will do is, JVM will ask, or JVM will inquire to the method under which this exception has occurred, that whether this exception is being handled or not. In response to the inquiry by JVM, the main method will express that it is not handling the exception which is created, or it is not handling the exception which has been occurring in that particular block of code or statements. So on receiving such a response, the JVM would forward this object to the default exception handler. So this default exception handler, what it will do, it will print the value of the object. So print the value of the exception object which has been created, and it will abnormally terminate the program. Okay, that means if I have certain statement after this, so let us say if I have a print statement or display statement that after exception, something like this here. So under this scenario, if it is abnormally terminated, then it will throw an exception and this will not be printed. However, if the exception would have been handled, this particular statement would have been printed. Okay, so initially what happens is, whenever an exception is occurring, the JVM, it will request, or it will ask the method which has been under which the exception has occurred, and if that exception is not handled within that particular method, it will try to call a request, or it will send a request to the method which is which is the calling method of that particular method, if that is also not handled, then JVM will pass the object to the default exception handler, and the default exception handler will print the value of the exception object, and it will abnormally terminate the program. Let us look into another example where we are using a method. So let us consider the same program. So class ABC, within here I will have the main method. So let me write it down: public static void main string arguments, and within this particular main method, let me now create an object of this particular class, new ABC, and after that let me call a method um, using this particular object. So let us call the test method. Okay, so within this particular class itself, let me write down the next method which has been called. So let us write down void test, and here we will write the block of code which is there. So int a is equal to 50, b is equal to 0 comma c, then c is equal to a by b, and finally I would like to print the value of c. So this is just we are introducing another method under which we are trying to create the exception. So now the execution of the program will be in such a way that initially it will start from the main method, and once it encounters this particular statement, the control would be straight away transferred to the method from the main method. Okay, so from the statement which has the calling, basically from the method call to the main method. So from whenever the execution enters at this stage, the normal flow will go on, and here at this point exception would be occurring. Now whenever this exception is occurred, or whenever there is an exception like that, so what it will do is it will simply so what it will do is it will simply create an object. This particular method will be creating an object with the details like exception, class name, then we will have description, and we will have the stack trace. So this particular object now is created by the method under which the exception has occurred. Okay, so now this particular method, this particular object would be sent to the JVM. So whenever JVM receives this object, exception object, it will inquire the method under which the exception has occurred, with whether that exception has been handled or not. If that exception is not handled, or if the method sends a response that it has not been handled, JVM, what it will do is it will try to inquire the method where the function call has occurred. That means the inquiry will be going to the method which is the calling method of the respective exception generating method. So in this case main is the method, so main method will now be responding to the JVM whether it has been handled or whether the exception has been handled or not. So here, since the exception is not handled, after receiving a response from the main method, JVM will pass this object to the default exception handler, and the job of the exception handler would be to print the particular exception object and abnormally terminate the program. So um, in order to check uh, which particular method is generating the exception object, we have to be sure about this, that whenever we are encountering or wherever we are encountering the exception, that particular method would be creating that exception object. So I believe now we are little clear about how an exception object is created, and basically we also understood that the method where the exception has occurred, that will be creating the exception object and would be sending to the JVM will be requesting for the exception handling not requesting, inquiring about the exception handling in that particular method. If it is not done, it also inquires the exception handling mechanism adopted by the calling method. However, we saw that since there is no such provision in both the methods, JVM would be sending the exception object to the default exception handler, and once the default exception handler receives it, it will simply print that particular exception object details and abnormally terminate the program. So in both these scenarios, what we could do is we could simply introduce the try catch block in order to handle the exception. So suppose in this particular scenario we will be introducing the try block here as well as the catch block, because um, without a catch we will not be able to execute this particular method. So here we can use either e dot stack trace, print stack trace, and so on, right? So or any user defined statement will also be fine. Similarly, in this particular scenario, what I can do is I can either introduce try catch block here at this particular point, okay? Otherwise, I could also use the try catch block in the method call wherever I have called this particular method. So catch, we can use it here. So either here or here we can use the try catch block so that our exception is handled. Now talking about one more exception handling concept, which is the primary topic of discussion today, is the throw keyword. So when we are talking about the throw keyword, let us first look at the syntax of throw keyword. So if we are considering the syntax, so basically syntax is we will be using the throw keyword followed by new keyword, then we will have the exception class name and followed by the error message. So if we have any sort of message which we need to print for this exception, we can use this. So this is basically a typical syntax of the throw keyword. Now we have to understand that this particular throw keyword works for explicit exceptions. So if we are defining some exceptions, or if we have user defined exceptions, then we can use this particular throw keyword. So it is used for explicit exceptions and not user defined exception, not explicit exceptions or user defined exceptions and not predefined exceptions, not predefined exceptions. It is preferably used in, not preferably, it is used in explicit exceptions or user defined exceptions. And how do we basically write this? Whenever we are writing a particular class, let's say a particular class is here, so within this we have public static void main. So this main method will be having the throw keyword. Okay, so public static void main. So inside this we can simply write throw new arithmetic exception. Okay, arithmetic exception, and we can simply close this. Okay, now whenever we are using this particular statement, it will give the same output as we would be getting in this particular program. Okay, that means if we are executing this, what is the output that we should get? We should get exception in thread main, and suppose we are using this as java.lang dot arithmetic exception, and what was the logical error here? That divide by 0, right? So the description here is divide by 0, and then we will have at, let's say the program is abc.main, and then we will have abc.java, and we will mention the line number, let's say 1 2 3 and 4. So not 4 5. So this particular error or this particular exception we will also get whenever we are introducing just this single line in place of or instead of what we have already seen in the previous example, right? So this throw new arithmetic exception, so this arithmetic exception is something which is already predefined, right? So generally we do not use this throw keyword, because this throw keyword is basically used by the programmer. Okay, so here what was happening here in this particular case, what was happening, this entire object, this particular object that has been created, so this has been created by the method where the exception has been occurring. Okay, but if we are considering the throw keyword, we generally do not depend upon the main method in order to create the exception object. So whenever we are using the throw keyword, essentially we mean that the object, the exception object which would be created is basically created by the programmer. So this will be created by the programmer explicitly. So whenever we are talking about an explicit exception, that means a user defined or a custom exception, we will also see this how we can do that. So we have to understand that the programmer would be creating this particular exception object which would be sent to the JVM in order to analyze whether that particular exception has been handled or not. But as of now, we have to understand that this throw keyword is explicitly used for explicit exceptions only. That means for custom defined exception or user defined exception. If there is any predefined exception, we do not need to use this particular exception handling throw keyword. We simply have to use the try catch block, or we can simply use the not use the main method can simply create the exception object. Here the exception object is basically created by the programmer. This will be a little bit more clear when we will talk about an example. So suppose we have been talking about user defined or custom exception. Now how do we do this? Basically what happens that, suppose I have an exception. Okay, So I have an exception. That exception may be a condition. So let's say the condition is, if I am less than 18, I am not allowed to vote. So voting not allowed. So it will allow only greater than 18. So here voting would be allowed. So this condition, I am considering this as an exception and I am putting it under an exception class. So now whenever something is taken, whenever an age input is taken from the user, what it will do, it will simply match with the exception class which has already been created with the custom defined conditions or user defined conditions, and it will throw us an exception if the age is less than 18. Okay, sorry, if the age is less than 18. So this is the main working principle behind the custom or user defined exception. So how do we do this in a program? So whenever we want to do this in a program, let us first define an exception class for this particular condition, and if we are trying to incorporate this particular exception inside our program, how does it look like? So suppose we want to create a customized exception. For that we have to use a class which is known as voting. I have named it as voting exception, and this will be extending or inheriting the properties of the runtime exception. So we can under customize exception, we can always create both runtime and compile time exceptions, but we have to make sure that whenever we are using compile time exception, we have to extend or inherit simply the exception class, and whenever we are extending or inheriting the runtime exception, we have to inherit the runtime exception class, which is the parent class of all runtime exceptions. So here what I'm trying to do, I will try to create a constructor here. So let me first create a constructor, and here we are considering a parameterized constructor. So suppose I have an exception. The constructor as each the class name should be, so I'll have this particular constructor which is voting exception, and here I will be writing, or I will be passing the parameter as s, and I will be using the super keyword in order to pass this message to the JVM for the pass this message, which is actually passed from the calling method or from the main method to JVM. Okay, so I will close the class here. So this is basically the customized exception that we have created. So customized exception that we have created, and how do I incorporate this within my program? So I will use another class, let's say class vote, and within this class I shall have the main method which is public static void main, and then let's say string arguments. So within this main method, now what I'm trying to do, I will be having a, let's say, an age parameter. Okay, so the age parameter or the age variable will be holding the age, so that you can always get it as an input from the user, or let me just declare it. Okay, so integer, let's say age, and here I am mentioning age as, let's say, 17. Okay, so what happens is, what is the condition, that if the, what we mentioned was, if the condition was less than, if the age was less than 18, then the person will not be allowed to vote, otherwise he is allowed to vote. Okay, so here we will be introducing the condition which is, if age is less than 18. So under this situation, there will be an exception which would be thrown. So here I will use the throw keyword. So throw new will call the class, exception class, which we have created, which is the voting exception, and we will try to pass an error message which will be captured by the string here. So here let's say not allowed. So this is the message that I'm going to pass from my main method, or pass in the exception, yes. So and then we will also have a else statement here saying that otherwise just print system dot out dot println, and otherwise just print you are allowed. So now under this situation, if we closely observe this particular program, so what I'm trying to do is I have already created an exception which is a type of runtime exception, and I'm trying to call that exception whenever I'm throwing this particular exception from the main method. So here what happens, using the throw keyword, I am actually creating an exception object, and that particular exception object is actually passing this particular description to the JVM. Okay, to the JVM this description would be passed. So now what happens, whenever I'm using this throw keyword, essentially this is a programmer defined exception object. Here the main method will not be responsible of creating the exception object and will be passing to the JVM. Instead, the programmer himself will be creating an object. So this particular object would be created which will have the class name. So the class name here is the voting exception. Then it will have the description. So description here again is passed from this particular as a parameter to the constructor, which will again be transferring this to the JVM, or will be informing the JVM about this particular description. And we will also have the stack trace. So stack trace is nothing but the line number in which the exception has occurred. Now we have to understand that whenever we are using the throw keyword, okay, whenever we are using here the throw keyword, or let's say the throw statement, essentially we are just creating an exception object. We are not handling the exception object, okay, or we are not handling the exception. So we can throw either checked or unchecked exception, but generally throw is used for, as already mentioned, it is used for used best with the customized exception. And the thing is that it creates the exception object manually by the programmer, and it will be handing it over to the JVM. So now what happens is, the dependency on the main method in order to create the exception object and then passing to the JVM is not there. The programmer will himself generate this object, or will create this exception object, and it will transfer it to the JVM, which will again transfer it to the exception handler if there is any, or it will simply pass it on to the default exception handler, which will terminate the program. Now we have to understand that if we are considering this particular scenario, okay, we are simply creating the exception object, but we are not handling it. Okay, in order to handle the exception object, we have to follow the traditional approach of try and catch block. So here what we will try to do, we will put this under the try block. Okay, so this will be under the try, and after this particular block is executed, that means after the try block is done, we also have to associate the catch block here. So let's say catch, and then we will, since we know the class that we have created, so voting exception e, and finally here we will be writing down, let's say e dot print stack trace, or you can use any statement that you feel like here, any print statement that you would feel like here. But we have to understand that if we are supposed to handle this voting exception, we have to use the try catch block. So throw keyword or the throw statement basically is used in order to create the exception object. Okay, it will create the exception object manually, and it will be handing it over to the JVM, but it will not be removing that exception, or it will not be handling that exception. In order to handle the exception, we always have to use the try and the catch block. So this is what it means. Now, one another important aspect that we have to remember is that if we write any statement after the throw statement, then that particular statement will not execute, or it will not be taken care of. So if suppose I have something like this right after the throw statement, which is system.out.println, and let's say after throw. So suppose I have this particular statement which I want to print right after, and I have written it right after a throw statement, then this particular statement will not execute. So this we always have to remember, because whenever we are using this throw, immediately what happens, an exception object is created, and this exception object would be then transferred to the JVM, and JVM will be searching for any exception handler if it is available. So if it is available, that means in this program it is available, right? So try and catch block is there. So what happens, the control will be immediately transferred from here to the catch block. It works similarly with the try block. So here this particular statement will not be executed. So these are some of the things that we have to remember while we are using the throw statement. So the first thing that we have to understand is that whenever we are using the throw keyword, okay, so whenever we are using the throw keyword, basically we use this throw either with checked or unchecked exceptions. We can use it for both compile time as well as runtime exceptions. And second important thing is that it works best for uh, customized exceptions. So whenever we want to create an exception, we can create it and use the throw statement, or we can use the throw keyword. So works best for customized exceptions. And the next important thing is that regarding throw, we have to understand is that it creates an exception object. It creates an exception object manually and passes over to JVM. So the dependency on the method under which the exception has occurred, it will be very limited. I mean, it is not there at all. The main method or the method will not be creating the exception object at all. Okay, the last and one of the most important factor is that we cannot write any statement after the throw will not be executed, and basically it will give us a code not reachable or statement unreachable error. Executed or give a statement unreachable error. So this particular point we have to remember, that we cannot write any statement after throw. So these are some of the aspects which we have to remember when we are using throw. So basically throw, as already mentioned, we are using it to create a exception object manually, and it is always associated with an instance. So here when we are considering the new keyword, we are actually associating a new instance of that particular exception class which we have created, or let's say an exception class which is already existing. So this is how basically we can incorporate exceptions in our incorporate throw in our programs. And we have to understand that we can either create a checked or an unchecked exception, but whenever we are using throw, it is used best for customized type of exception. That means those exceptions which we are creating it on our own. Okay, so this is all about the throw keyword. We will talk about throws as well as the difference between throw and throws, and also talk about how to develop a customized exception in my next video. Thank you.